I'll tell you an absolutely true story. I didn't see any monsters, but after the events described below, I couldn't sleep peacefully for months. And even now, remembering them gives me chills. It happened in the early 2000s. My brother, 3 of our friends, and I decided to go out into nature, but not just anywhere. We chose the mountains. After a short discussion, we decided to head to a remote village and hike through the mountains for a few days. We packed all our things, including a tent, and set off on our journey. Upon arriving in the village, we decided to stock up on supplies at a local store. I chose to stay outside, have a smoke, and keep an eye on our belongings since there were, of course, no storage lockers. While my friends were shopping, I struck up a conversation with a woman who asked who we were and where we were from. One thing led to another, and I explained everything to her. She then told me that under no circumstances should we go into the mountains. Pointing in their direction, she went on to explain that over the past few decades, more than 50 people had disappeared in those mountains, many of them tourists just like us. Even her own son had gone missing there. None of the missing were ever found, only their belongings and empty tents remained. No footprints, no traces, nothing. The locals had long since stopped going there. Our friends had already come out of the store, and the woman disappeared inside. I decided not to say anything for now, but to tell this story later, when we were already in the mountains, to make an impression and, of course, to scare them a little. I was skeptical about the woman's story, so we headed straight for those very mountains. A bit about the surroundings. The mountains begin with a dense forest and numerous small streams. At the foot of the highest mountain, there was a swamp, which we decided to carefully bypass, as its disgusting miasma could be smelled even from within the forest. Moreover, much of the area was either swampy or at least very damp, and in some places, foul-smelling water seeped right from under our feet. The first day didn't go without incidents. As soon as we ventured deeper into the forest, all sounds immediately ceased. Near the forest entrance and closer to the village, we could hear birds singing, the occasional murmur of water, and even faint noises coming from the road. But inside the forest, there was absolute silence. I could hear every breath my friends took. I could distinctly hear the squelching of wet grass beneath their feet, even several meters away from me. As we skirted the swamp and began ascending the mountain, something interesting happened. We walked in silence, occasionally forcing a tense laugh to lighten the oppressive atmosphere. Suddenly, I heard a scream from the girl who was with us. Her cry startled me, but what I saw next scared me even more. She had slightly sunk her foot into a small, damp hole where the soil was loose and filled with water. I quickly helped her pull her foot out, and for a moment, I relaxed, but then, from the small crater left by her foot, a thick, dark red liquid began to seep out. I frowned, watching as the mud and water mixed with something eerily similar to blood. Then bubbles started to rise, and the flow suddenly stopped. The whole way, we kept discussing what it could have been. As a stubborn rationalist, I threw out theory after theory, from a dead animal that had been sucked into the pit to the sap of some plant, but none of it looked or sounded even remotely convincing. By evening, we had finally reached the mountain peak and set up camp. We were utterly exhausted, overwhelmed, and frightened. We were also completely fed up with the stench of peat and decay. We drank, then went to sleep, feeling deeply dissatisfied with the day. I decided to keep quiet about the woman's story to avoid scaring anyone. However, remembering it myself, I had a hard time falling asleep that night. I had nightmares, tension, screaming, people, glowing eyes, bats. I felt a tangible horror, fear, confusion and an overwhelming sense of endless human suffering. Several times I woke up in the middle of the night, but didn't dare to move until I drifted back to sleep. The next day greeted us with a thick fog in the morning. Adding to our distress, we decided not to stay in these dreadful mountains for another minute and to leave as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the journey back would also take an entire day, but luckily, a bit of scouting revealed that on the other side of the mountain, where the slope was much gentler, there was another village that was significantly closer, so we decided to head there instead. We stepped into the fog, descending the mountain. By the way, I should mention that everyone looked simply terrible. We left unnecessary junk in the mountains to lighten our journey. Additionally, it's worth noting that we had a compass, so we felt more or less confident most of the time. We walked in silence. Occasionally, a girl named Olga would make disturbing remarks, saying that she felt like someone was watching us from the fog, that she heard voices of people, and that at night she had heard sounds of bare feet slapping on puddles. We asked her to be quiet many times because we were on the edge. And in one of those moments, we suddenly saw a strange figure in the fog, resembling a person in a hood. But as we got closer, and it was unbearably eerie to do so in complete silence and fear, we discovered that it was just the corner of a tent. Our feelings were mixed, but not mine. The others thought it was someone's tent. Feeling a little happy, a little scared, but for some reason, I was completely sure that this tent had been standing there for years. As we got closer, we noticed that it was overgrown and covered in various plants, cobwebs, and dirt. At that moment, I had to tell them what the strange woman in the village had told me. This sparked arguments and shouting. I was severely scolded for not mentioning it earlier, but we had to calm down and keep going. Fortunately, according to our calculations, we should reach the village in about an hour to an hour and a half, and it wasn't even 4 o'clock yet. 2 hours later, we were in a state of confusion. We stood in the middle of a swampy field and saw endless expanses of fields, swamps, patches of forests, with a range of mountains visible on the horizon. It didn't make sense. We had been walking strictly north, without deviating, all according to the compass. But there was no village. And furthermore, when we had looked at this area from the mountains, there had been no swamps or lakes here. At that moment, we were overwhelmed with an incredible fear. The fog in the forest behind us thickened. At a distance of 10 meters, nothing was visible anymore. With frenzy and icy fear, realizing that we were stuck here for another night, by the time we reached the mountain where we had spent the previous night, it would already be dark, and no one wanted to walk at night. We quickly started heading back instead of fear. We now felt a clear sense of terror and anger at ourselves for going into these cursed mountains and swamps. We hurried toward the mountain, trying not to pay attention to the oppressive silence. We walked through the soggy grass, which bent beneath our feet as if there was deep water beneath the layer of earth. Suddenly, Olga screamed at the top of her lungs. I quickly turned around and didn't see her in an instant. My whole nervous system shrank into a lump. Then I saw Olga, who had sunk into the ground up to her waist. I ran toward her to pull her out. She was kicking and screaming. Because of that, she sank deeper and deeper. But with my brother's help, we managed to pull her out, which took tremendous effort. When we got her out of there, a white hole was left in the ground, the bottom of which was quickly filling with water. We frenzy in anticipation, as if waiting for red liquid to come out of it, but nothing like that happened. However, Olga looked at her legs and was horrified. They were scratched up to her calves, as if sliced with a dull knife, and there were small gaping holes, as if she had been bitten by leeches. She fell to the ground and sobbed in despair. We couldn't calm her down for a long time, and then we moved on. It was getting dark as we ascended the mountain. Although we were walking on the same road as before, we didn't encounter any tents, which made us even more anxious. I only dreamed of closing my eyes, and when I opened them again, finding myself at home. Finally, we reached the top of the mountain and found the spot where we had stopped the previous night. We found the fire pit, but to our greatest horror, there were no belongings that we had left behind. I was on edge. It was almost completely dark, and we, as a group, gathered firewood to start a fire. That night, no one slept. When the fire went out, it was completely dark, and no one wanted to go gather more wood. We huddled together and waited for dawn, so we could leave as fast as possible. At that moment, I began to feel sleepy, as I hadn't gotten enough rest the previous nights. I lay down slightly on the ground and pressed my ear to the rocky soil. My friends also relaxed a bit, but we were still tense. Slowly, I started to drift into sleep, but never actually fell asleep. I don't know how long I lay there like that. Then I heard it clearly and soberly. I'm sure I wasn't imagining it. I heard the scream of hundreds of people. The scream was coming from under the mountain, and I only heard it because I had my ear pressed to the mountain itself. I could hear people moaning and wailing beneath the mountain, voices of many people, both women and children, as if there was a huge factory of pain underneath the mountain. I felt such a chill and terror that I went numb. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The desperate, relentless choir of voices tearing at my head plunged me into such despair that it seemed as though there was a real hell beneath me. I am afraid to even remember the wild fantasies that crossed my mind when I thought about who these people were and why they were suffering so. But when the scream ended, it was already starting to get light. I couldn't recover for a long time. When it was fully dawn, we nearly ran away from that cursed place. Once we reached the village, we began to recover, but something finished me off completely when the panic in the forest ended. I had left a sweatshirt at the top of the mountain, one that my aunt had embroidered for me. There was a deer depicted on the sweatshirt, and it had disappeared along with everything else. When we got on the bus to return to the city, my gaze accidentally fell on a girl who had just come out of a store with a filled shopping bag. She was wearing my sweatshirt, and next to her was the woman who had earlier told me about the mountains. No one knows for sure in which mountains the story took place, or whether these events actually happened, but the fact that even experienced mountaineers disappear without a trace in the mountains remains a tragic reality. Perhaps this legend serves as a reminder of simple truths for novice hikers just beginning their journeys, a lesson in the necessity of friendship, mutual assistance, and obedience to the senior, more experienced route leader. One day, a hiking group set out into the mountains. Among them was a guide with a very quarrelsome nature. He constantly complained and was dissatisfied with everything. His backpack was heavier than everyone else's. His shoes pinched his feet. Sleeping on the ground was damp. And, in general, the sun didn't shine the way he wanted it to, and the whole world somehow refused to obey his wishes. Envy toward the instructor also crept into the young man's heart. Look at him, so skilled and agile. He never gets tired on the hike. Sings songs by the campfire. The guys respect him, and the girls admire him. Meanwhile, no one wanted to pay attention to the young hiker's constant whining anymore. And so, the young man decided to climb to the summit alone. While the group settled down for the night, he eagerly imagined the scene of everyone's surprise and admiration when they reached the peak the next day only to find him already there, the one who had been unfairly overlooked and despised. Night fell, and everyone went to sleep, while our heroes secretly set off for the summit. After some time, a storm began. The terrifying hurricane woke the entire group. It was then that they realized one of the hikers was missing. Risking their own lives, they set out to search for him. They looked for the unlucky traveler all night until morning and throughout the next day, but they didn't find a single trace of him. Then the instructor made the decision to descend. By that time, all the hikers were exhausted, worn out, and on edge. That evening, two of them got into an argument over a trivial matter. When the group woke up in the morning, they were horrified to see that the two friends who had argued were dead. Since then, people began to see the shadow of the Black Mountaineer in the mountains, and they saw it only before their death. For those who abandoned their friends, pushed them away, and did not offer a hand to help, the shadow of the rejected mountaineer would catch up with them and kill them.